by sunrise, the kingdom will call you either a miracle or a ghost. That was the first thing Ethan Miller heard when the palace gates closed behind him, and no one in the Blackwood court seemed cruel enough to pretend it was a blessing. The bells above the Capitol were ringing for a royal wedding, but outside the iron fence, people stood shoulder to shoulder with white candles cupped in their hands, their faces pale beneath the winter sky, their whispers floating through the cold like funeral prayers. Ethan sat alone in the back of the black carriage, dressed in ceremonial white, the fabric too fine for someone his family had spent 21 years calling worthless. Every silver stitch along his sleeves had been chosen to make him look pure, obedient, and grateful, but his fingers were clenched so tightly in his lap that his nails left small crescent marks in his palms. He did not look like a bride being delivered to a king. He looked like a secret being delivered to a tomb. Beyond the carriage window, Blackwood Palace rose from the cliffside like a crown carved out of storm clouds, all black stone, glass towers, and banners snapping in the sharp wind. At the top of the tallest tower, the royal flag hung still, a white wolf beneath a dark moon, and Ethan could not stop staring at it. The wolf's embroidered eyes seemed to follow him as the carriage rolled across the courtyard, past rows of guards in midnight uniforms, past nobles wrapped in fur and jewels, past servants who lowered their eyes the second they saw his face. They all knew. Of course they knew. 3 royal engagements had ended before the wedding night was over. 3 chosen Omegas from powerful houses had entered the bridal chamber of King Adrian Blackwood, and by morning, the kingdom had spoken of them only in soft voices and sealed records. No one said what happened. No one had to. Fear was sometimes louder than truth. The carriage door opened, and the cold struck Ethan first, biting through his gloves and sliding beneath his collar. A royal attendant offered him a hand without meeting his eyes. Ethan stepped down onto the marble path, and the crowd inside the palace courtyard fell silent with such suddenness that he could hear the faint crackle of candle flames beyond the gates. Somewhere to his left, a noblewoman whispered, "That poor Omega will not see the sunrise." Another voice answered, "The Millers must have truly wanted to be rid of him." Ethan kept walking. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave people permission to continue. His family had called him scentless, defective, an embarrassment wrapped in pretty skin. His father had not hugged him before sending him here. His mother had not cried. His older brother had only adjusted Ethan's collar and told him not to shame the Miller name in death the way he had in life. So Ethan walked with his chin lifted, not because he was brave, but because pride was the last thing they had failed to take from him. The grand doors opened before he touched them, revealing the royal chapel, a cathedral of black marble and silver glass. Hundreds of candles burned along the walls, their flames reflected in the polished floor until it looked as if Ethan were walking across a lake of stars. At the far end of the aisle stood King Adrian Blackwood. He was taller than Ethan expected, broad-shouldered and still as a statue, his black ceremonial coat lined with silver, his crown resting on dark hair that caught the candlelight like midnight. His skin was pale, his face beautiful in the cold, unreachable way of carved marble, and his eyes were a blue so sharp they seemed almost unreal. Ethan had heard stories about him all his life. The Alpha King who never smiled, the ruler who ended rebellions with silence and made old families bow with a glance, the cursed groom, the monster behind the locked bridal door. Yet when Adrian's eyes met his, Ethan did not see hunger or triumph. He saw warning. The realization slipped through Ethan like a thread pulled too tight. This was not a king waiting to claim a prize. This was a man watching someone step onto thin ice and knowing exactly where it would break. The priest's voice echoed through the chapel, formal and distant, but Ethan barely heard the words. He felt the court staring, felt every judgment pressing against his back, felt the invisible weight of his family's relief now that he was no longer their problem. When the vows came, Adrian's voice was low, steady, and without tenderness. Ethan answered clearly, refusing to let the room hear even one tremor. A ring of black silver slid onto his finger, cold enough to make him shiver, and somewhere high above them, a candle went out. Then another, then a third. A ripple moved through the chapel, but Adrian did not look away from Ethan. When the ceremony ended, the court bowed, not in celebration, but in expectation. Adrian stepped close enough that only Ethan could hear him, and the scent around him was like frost, cedar, and distant rain. His hand did not touch Ethan, but his shadow fell over him completely. "You will not survive the wedding night," the Alpha King said, his voice calm enough to be mercy and cruel enough to be truth. For one breath, Ethan felt the entire world waiting for him to break. Instead, he looked up at the man everyone feared and answered softly, "Then don't look away when I die." For the first time, something in Adrian Blackwood's perfect mask cracked. The crack in Adrian Blackwood's mask lasted less than a heartbeat, but Ethan saw it clearly enough to understand that the king was not untouched by his answer. Something moved behind those icy blue eyes, something sharp and unguarded, before the royal stillness returned and the Alpha King turned away as if the moment had never happened. The court began to breathe again. Silk rustled, jewels flashed, and carefully trained faces rearranged themselves into polite expressions, but the silence beneath it all remained heavy. Ethan followed Adrian down the long aisle with the black silver ring cold on his finger, feeling every stair slide across his back like winter rain. No one congratulated him. No one smiled. Even the priest avoided looking directly at him, as if a bridegroom chosen by death could carry bad luck by eye contact alone. Outside the chapel, the palace corridors stretched ahead in endless lines of black stone and silver lamps. Portraits of past kings watched from the walls, each Blackwood ruler painted with the same pale skin, same proud jaw, same wolfish blue gaze. Yet Adrian's portrait was the only one covered with a dark veil. Ethan noticed it as they passed a wide staircase, and despite himself, his steps slowed. Beneath the veil, the gold frame was new. The paint at the bottom edge still looked glossy. A living king with a covered portrait. That was not tradition. That was fear. Adrian noticed where Ethan was looking, and his voice came without warmth. "Do not ask questions you are not prepared to hear answered." Ethan turned his eyes forward. "I have been delivered to a cursed palace in wedding white. I believe I am past the comfort of not knowing." A servant walking behind them nearly stumbled. Adrian stopped. For one frozen second, every guard in the corridor seemed to hold still. Then the king looked at Ethan, not with anger, but with a strange, tired focus, as if he were trying to decide whether Ethan was foolish, brave, or simply too wounded to be careful. "The last person who said that to me," Adrian said, "begged to forget by midnight." Ethan felt the words settle in his chest, but he did not lower his gaze. "Did you grant that wish?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "No one grants wishes in this house." He resumed walking, and Ethan followed, though now the palace felt less like a building and more like a creature listening through its walls. They passed the grand reception hall, where tables had been set for a wedding feast no one intended to enjoy. White roses filled crystal vases, but their petals had been tipped in silver wax, preserving them in a beauty that felt unnatural. The nobles gathered there bowed as Adrian entered, yet Ethan saw how their shoulders stiffened when the king moved too close. This was not devotion. It was survival wearing expensive clothing. At the head of the hall, 3 empty chairs stood beside Adrian's throne, each draped in white cloth. Ethan knew what they represented before anyone told him. The 3 chosen Omegas who had come before him. The first had been from House Everly, famous for a voice that could calm restless alphas. The second had been from House Vale, praised for a scent like spring orchards. The third had been from House Hart, so beloved by the capital that citizens had lined the streets with flowers when he arrived. All 3 had been perfect in ways Ethan had never been allowed to imagine for himself. All 3 had vanished from public life before dawn. Their families received royal compensation, official condolences, and sealed silence. Ethan's family had accepted the proposal anyway. That truth did not hurt as much as he expected. Perhaps because pain, when repeated often enough, eventually became a room one learned to live inside. A silver-haired nobleman near the wine table leaned toward another guest and murmured, "At least this one was not useful to anyone." Ethan heard it. Adrian heard it too. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The nobleman's face went pale as Adrian slowly turned his head. No command was given. No threat was spoken. The man simply bowed so deeply that his forehead nearly touched the edge of the table. Ethan should have felt satisfaction. Instead, he felt confusion. Adrian Blackwood had warned him he would die, had spoken to him with the calm of a judge, and yet he would not allow others to insult him openly. It made no sense. Then again, nothing about this palace did. Dinner passed like a painting of a celebration made by someone who had never seen joy. Music played from the balcony, soft and elegant, but no one danced. Servants filled glasses, but most remained untouched. Adrian sat beside Ethan without eating. His gloved hand rested near a silver knife he never used, and his attention never fully left the far end of the hall, where a tall mirror stood between two marble pillars. The mirror was covered in black cloth, just like the portrait. Ethan tried not to look at it. The more he avoided it, the more he felt it waiting. Near 10 o'clock, the candles along the walls flickered at the same time. Conversation died. Somewhere deep within the palace, a clock began to toll. One sound, then another, then another. Adrian rose before the 10th chime faded, and the entire court stood with him. His face had gone still again, but Ethan saw the faint strain at the corner of his mouth. The king was afraid, not for himself, for Ethan. That knowledge was more unsettling than any warning. Adrian extended one hand, palm open, formal and distant. Ethan looked at it, then at the silent court, then at the 3 white-covered chairs beside the throne. His life had been arranged by people who wanted him gone, but this step belonged only to him. He placed his hand in Adrian's. The Alpha King's fingers closed around his with careful restraint, as though Ethan were something fragile he had no right to hold. Together, they walked toward the private wing. While behind them the wedding feast remained untouched, the covered mirrors seemed to darken, and every candle flame leaned in the same direction, as if the whole palace were watching them approach the room where no bridegroom had ever returned unchanged. The private wing of Blackwood Palace did not feel private at all. It felt like every stone had been taught to remember screams no one was allowed to discuss. Ethan walked beside Adrian through a corridor so long that the wedding music behind them faded into a distant, polished lie. The lamps here burned with blue flames instead of gold, casting the walls in a cold glow that made the silver thread on Ethan's sleeves look almost alive. Their joined hands remained between them, formal enough for the servants watching from doorways, but Ethan could feel the careful tension in Adrian's grip. The king held him as if he were guiding him across the edge of a frozen lake, each step measured, each breath controlled, and that restraint frightened Ethan more than roughness would have. At the far end of the corridor, a set of double doors waited beneath an arch carved with wolves, moons, and unfamiliar symbols. 2 royal guards stood before it, but when Adrian approached, they stepped aside without looking at Ethan. One of them made a small sign over his heart, quick and silent, the kind people made before a funeral. Ethan noticed. Adrian did too. "Leave us," the king ordered. The guards bowed and retreated, their boots echoing away until even that sound disappeared. Ethan stared at the doors. The blackwood was polished to a mirror shine, but beneath the surface he saw faint silver lines spreading like frost across glass. They were not decoration. They looked like seals, warnings, locks meant to keep something inside. Adrian released Ethan's hand, and the sudden absence of warmth made the air feel colder. "This is your final chance," Adrian said. His voice was low, but the corridor carried it clearly. "I can send you to the Eastern Estate before midnight. The court will call it illness. Your family will be compensated. You will live." Ethan laughed once, softly, without humor. "My family sold me because they thought I was already useless. If I return alive, but unwanted, they will find a smaller cage." Adrian's expression did not change, yet something in his gaze sharpened. "You speak as if death is easier than going home." Ethan looked at the silver seals on the door and saw, not the palace, but the breakfast room in the Miller estate where his father had signed the royal agreement without once asking Ethan to sit down. He remembered the smell of lemon polish, the ticking clock, the envelope placed on the table like a receipt. His mother had stood near the window in a cream dress, twisting her wedding ring while refusing to look at him. His older brother, Caleb, had read the terms aloud in a calm voice, as if discussing a shipment of furniture. A rejected omega of marriageable age. No known sense signature. No active bond. Suitable for royal substitution. Ethan had listened from the doorway until his father finally noticed him and said, "Do not make this dramatic. For once, your existence is useful." The memory should have burned. Instead, it sat inside him like a small, cold stone. "Home is not always a place that wants you alive," Ethan said. Adrian was silent for several seconds. The blue flames moved across his face, carving shadows beneath his cheekbones, making him look both regal and exhausted. "I did not choose you. I know. I told the council to send no one. I believe you." That seemed to surprise him. Ethan turned toward him fully, the white train of his wedding clothes whispering over the black floor. "You have worn me more honestly than anyone in my family ever did. That does not make you kind, your majesty, but it does make you different from them." Adrian looked away first. It was subtle, but Ethan saw it, and in a palace built on fear, that small surrender felt almost impossible. From behind the sealed doors came a sound so faint Ethan might have imagined it. A single knock, slow and patient, from the other side. His breath caught. Adrian's face went completely still. "Do not answer anything you hear after we enter," he said. "Do not speak to the mirrors. Do not follow my voice unless you can see my mouth moving. And if I tell you to run, you run, even if I beg you to stay." Ethan's fingers curled around the black silver ring on his hand. "Has it used your voice before?" Adrian did not answer, and that was answer enough. The seals on the doors began to glow, one by one, like stars waking beneath ice. The air filled with the scent of frost, cedar, and something older than the palace itself. Adrian placed his palm against the center seal, and the doors opened inward without a sound. Beyond them, the bridal chamber waited in impossible stillness, covered in white flowers, black candles, and one enormous mirror draped in velvet. The room was beautiful in the way a storm could be beautiful from miles away, before it reached your house and turned the windows dark. Ethan stepped across the threshold before fear could convince him to remain outside. Adrian followed, and the doors closed behind them with the finality of a verdict. The moment the last seal locked, the covered mirror breathed. The covered mirror moved as if something behind the velvet had taken a slow breath, and every candle in the bridal chamber bent toward it. Ethan froze just inside the locked doors, his pulse striking hard beneath the high collar of his wedding clothes, while Adrian stepped in front of him with the quiet speed of a man who had practiced fear until it looked like discipline. The chamber itself was enormous, larger than Ethan's bedroom at the Miller estate and colder than the chapel below. White roses climbed the bedposts in perfect spirals, their petals sealed in silver wax like the flowers in the reception hall. Black candles stood along the windowsills, their flames blue and steady despite the wind pressing against the glass. Beyond the windows, the Capitol lay hundreds of feet below the cliff, scattered with lights, distant and unreachable, as if Ethan had already left the living world and was looking back at it from somewhere far away. Adrian did not touch the mirror. He did not even look directly at it. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, where a circle of silver marks had been set into the black marble. Ethan recognized the same symbols from the door, but inside the chamber they looked older, worn thin in places, as if generations of desperate hands had tried to rewrite them. "Stand inside the circle," Adrian said. Ethan heard the command, but he also heard the strain beneath it. "Will it protect me?" "For a while." "That is not comforting. I stopped being comforting years ago." The answer should have sounded cruel, yet it landed with the weight of confession. Ethan stepped into the circle, and the silver marks glowed faintly beneath his shoes. A cool pressure rose around him, not painful, not even unpleasant, more like the invisible walls of a glass room. Adrian remained outside it. That detail struck Ethan harder than it should have. "What about you?" he asked. Adrian finally glanced at him. The room does not want me protected. Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the velvet covering the mirror slipped from its frame without anyone touching it. The cloth fell in a silent wave to the floor, revealing glass so dark it did not reflect the chamber at first. It reflected a hallway Ethan had never seen, long and ruined, lined with the same blue lamps as the private wing, but dimmer, older, wrong. Then the image shifted. The bridal chamber appeared inside the mirror, almost identical to the real one, except the flowers were gray, the candles were unlit, and a second Adrian Blackwood stood on the other side of the glass. Ethan stopped breathing. The figure had Adrian's face, Adrian's height, Adrian's crown, but everything about him felt unfinished, as if a portrait had learned to move before the artist gave it a soul. His eyes were the same blue, yet empty of human hesitation. His smile was soft, almost gentle, and that made it worse. The real Adrian went rigid. "Do not look at him," he said. Ethan tried to obey, but the mirror version tilted his head, and his lips moved with Adrian's voice. "Little Omega," he said, the words smooth as cold water. "You came." Ethan's skin prickled. The voice was perfect, not similar. Perfect. It carried the same frost, the same cedar, the same royal weight, but underneath it was something hollow, a beautiful room with no floor. Adrian moved closer to the mirror, his hands closing into fists at his sides. "Speak to me, not him." The reflection smiled wider. "You brought me another offering and still pretend you are innocent." The air inside the chamber tightened. The silver circle beneath Ethan's feet brightened, and a faint ache bloomed in the center of his chest, beneath the embroidered white fabric. He looked down, confused, and saw a pale mark glowing through the cloth, a shape like a crescent moon caught inside a thorn crown. He had never seen it before. Adrian saw it too. For the first time since Ethan had entered the palace, the Alpha King looked truly shaken. "Where did you get that mark?" he asked. Ethan pressed a hand over his chest. "I do not know." From inside the mirror, the shadow Adrian's expression changed. The empty amusement vanished, replaced by recognition so intense it felt almost like hunger, though not the human kind. "There you are," he whispered. The silver circle flickered. Ethan staggered, not from pain, but from a sudden rush of scent filling the room, something soft, bright, and impossible, like rain on white lilies after a long drought. Adrian inhaled sharply, and the sound seemed to frighten him. "Your scent," he said, barely above a whisper. Ethan's throat tightened. All his life, he had been called scentless, defective, blank. Yet now the room was responding to him as if it had been waiting for him longer than he had been alive. The shadow Adrian lifted one hand and placed it against the other side of the mirror. The glass rippled beneath his palm. "Not an offering," he said, looking only at Ethan. "A key." The candles went out at once, and in the sudden blue darkness, the silver circle broke. The silver circle broke without a sound, but Ethan felt it as if the floor had vanished beneath him. One moment he stood inside a faint ring of protection. The next, the glowing symbols scattered across the black marble like spilled starlight, fading one by one beneath his shoes. The room did not move, yet everything in it changed. The air grew deep and heavy, the blue darkness pressing against the windows, the white roses trembling on their stems though there was no wind. Ethan reached for balance and found Adrian's hand already there, closing around his wrist with careful strength. "Stay behind me," Adrian said, but the command had lost its certainty. The mirror had become brighter than the room now, a dark doorway framed in silver, and the other Adrian stood behind the glass with one palm still pressed against it. Where his fingers touched, the surface rippled like water disturbed by moonlight. "He is not supposed to reach through before midnight," Adrian whispered. Ethan looked toward the tall clock beside the fireplace. Its hands had stopped at 11:59. Then why has the clock stopped? Adrian did not answer quickly enough. The shadow inside the mirror smiled, as if he had heard the question and enjoyed it. "Because time obeys a bride who was made for the door." The word bride moved through the chamber like a key turning in a lock. The mark beneath Ethan's wedding clothes warmed, not painfully, but with a strange familiarity that frightened him more than pain would have. He pressed his palm to his chest, feeling the crescent and thorn shape glowing beneath the fabric. Memories rose, uninvited. His mother fastening high collars around his neck, even during summer. A family doctor placing bitter drops under his tongue every morning. His father forbidding him from attending public scent ceremonies. Caleb laughing when other young omegas bloomed into recognized fragrances, while Ethan remained blank. He had thought those memories were proof of his failure. Now they arranged themselves into something colder. Proof of concealment. They knew. Ethan said. Adrian turned to him. Who knew? My family. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. They kept something from waking up in me. The shadow, Adrian's gaze, softened with cruel understanding. Not something. Someone's inheritance. The glass rippled again, and the room responded. The covered portrait in the hallway had felt wrong. The covered mirror in the feast hall had felt wrong, but this was worse. The entire chamber seemed to lean toward Ethan, not like a monster preparing to strike, but like a starving house recognizing the person who carried its missing name. Adrian stepped between Ethan and the mirror fully, shoulders squared, crown catching a thin line of blue light. You will not use him. Use him. The reflection laughed, and the sound was Adrian's laughter if all warmth had been removed from it. You still do not understand what the old kings did. You think I am the curse because that is easier than admitting I am the receipt. Ethan stared at the mirror. The receipt for what? Adrian's hand tightened around his wrist, not to silence him, but in warning. The shadow answered anyway. A bargain. The Blackwoods wanted a throne that no rival could take. The Millers wanted to survive beside monsters without ever kneeling. So one family gave its kings to darkness, and the other family promised an Omega born with a scent pure enough to close the door when the debt came due. The words landed with terrible precision. Ethan looked at Adrian, but the king's face had gone pale beneath the blue light. You knew about a bargain? Ethan asked. I knew fragments, Adrian said. Old records. Broken prayers. Nothing complete. And the other Omegas? The question escaped before he could soften it. Adrian's expression tightened with grief, so raw that Ethan wished he had not asked. They were chosen by the council because they were powerful, he said. They were never the right bloodline. The room rejected them. I tried to stop the marriages after the first. After the second, I locked myself away for a year. After the third, I ordered the council to bring no one else. His eyes moved to the door, sealed from the inside. They brought you anyway. Ethan should have felt betrayed by the palace, by the council, by the king standing before him. But the deepest betrayal still wore his family's name. The Millers had not sold him because he was worthless. They had sold him because he was valuable in a way that could get them rewarded without forcing them to explain what they had hidden. A soft chime rang from the stopped clock. One note. Midnight without movement. The mirror's surface bowed outward. Adrian released Ethan only to place both hands against the glass, holding it in place as the shadow on the other side mirrored him perfectly. For an instant, they looked like one man divided by a thin sheet of night. Adrian's breath shook. Ethan saw the strain in his arms, the flicker of pain across his face, the way the crown slipped slightly from his hair. The king was not protecting his throne. He was holding a door shut with his own body. The shadow Adrian looked past him and met Ethan's eyes. Come closer, missing half, he said gently. Ask him what happens if I remain trapped. Ethan's throat went dry. What happens? Adrian closed his eyes. The curse keeps taking pieces of me until there is nothing left but him. The crown slid free and struck the marble with a clear, lonely sound. Ethan stepped forward before fear could stop him, and the scent of rain and white lilies filled the chamber brighter than any candle. Ethan had spent his entire life being told that absence was the only thing he carried well. No scent, no influence, no worth, no future that did not depend on someone else deciding where he belonged. Yet the moment he stepped toward Adrian and the mirror, the chamber answered him like a sleeping cathedral hearing its first hymn in 100 years. The scent of rain and white lilies unfolded from his skin in luminous waves, not overwhelming, not desperate, but impossibly calm, spreading across the black marble. lifting the fallen velvet from the floor, making the silver marks flicker back to life one fragile line at a time. Adrian opened his eyes, and for the first time, Ethan saw the Alpha King without his crown, without the cold mask of the throne, without the distance he used like armor. He looked young in the blue darkness, exhausted, afraid, human. His hands remained pressed against the mirror, but the glass was bending around them now, pulling at him as if the reflection on the other side had found the seam between body and shadow. "Stay back," Adrian said, though his voice had thinned with strain. "Ethan, please." The word please struck harder than any command. No one had ever spoken Ethan's name like that, as though it mattered whether he remained whole. For one breath, he almost obeyed. In the shadow, Adrian smiled from behind the glass and slowly lowered himself to one knee. The movement was so graceful, so deliberate, that the chamber itself seemed to pause. Ethan stopped. Adrian went completely still. On the other side of the mirror, the dark copy of the king bowed his head, not to Adrian, not to the throne, but to Ethan. At last, the shadow said softly, "The Miller moon returns to the Blackwood night." Ethan felt the mark beneath his clothes flare warm against his chest. The words should have meant nothing, but some deep, buried part of him recognized them. A lullaby with no melody. A family secret hidden beneath medicine and shame. A truth wrapped so tightly in silence that it had begun to look like failure. "Why are you kneeling?" Ethan asked. The shadow lifted his face. Adrian's face, but older somehow in its emptiness, ancient in a way no living man could be. "Because you were never meant to be offered to me," he said. "You were meant to command me." The chamber tilted around Ethan, or perhaps it was only his understanding of it that shifted. Every insult he had swallowed, every locked door, every bitter drop placed under his tongue, every family portrait where he had been pushed to the far edge as if he were an accidental shadow, all of it rearranged into a single, cruel design. The Millers had not hidden him because he was weak. They had hidden him because a weak Omega could be ignored, but an Omega born to command a royal curse could change the balance of every noble house in the kingdom. Adrian made a quiet sound, almost a warning, almost a prayer. "Do not listen to him. He tells the truth only when it helps him open the door. And you hide the truth because you think it keeps the door closed," the shadow replied, still kneeling. "How noble! How useless!" The glass pulled again. Adrian staggered one step forward, his palms sinking slightly into the mirror surface. Ethan saw silver light crawl up the king's wrists like frost, beautiful and wrong, and the scent of cedar and storm around him began to thin. Not vanish. Thin, as if the room were erasing him carefully, one breath at a time. "Adrian," Ethan said. The king's eyes found his, and behind the fear, there was apology. Not the easy kind spoken after a small offense, but the kind a person carried because he had survived a disaster and others had not. "I am sorry," Adrian said, "for bringing you here, for not stopping them." Ethan moved closer, each step drawing more of his scent into the room. "You tried. I failed. So did everyone who was supposed to protect me." The words came out steadier than he felt. "The difference is, you warned me before the door closed." Adrian's jaw tightened, but he could not pull away from the mirror. The shadow watched them with patient interest, still on one knee, his hand pressed to the glass from the other side. "Touch the mark," he said to Ethan. "Not the mirror. Not me. The mark. Let what they buried remember its shape." Adrian's eyes sharpened. "No, will it hurt him?" Ethan asked. "It will wake him," Adrian said. "There is a difference." The shadow laughed quietly. "There is always a difference when kings are afraid of losing control." Ethan looked down at his own trembling hands. He was afraid. Of course he was afraid. Bravery had never meant the absence of fear. It meant knowing fear was in the room and choosing not to let it speak for him. He placed one palm over the glowing mark on his chest. The warmth surged beneath his skin, and the chamber vanished. Not literally, not completely, but in his mind, the walls became memory. He saw a ballroom from generations ago, black and silver, filled with wolves painted on banners and moonflowers arranged in white bowls. He saw a Blackwood king standing before a mirror with darkness behind his eyes. He saw a Miller Omega beside him, not cowering, not offered, but calm. One hand raised as silver light moved from his palm into the glass. Then the vision broke into fragments. A promise made, a promise twisted, descendants forgetting, families lying, a curse mistaken for a monster when it was really an unpaid debt. Ethan gasped as the chamber returned. Adrian was closer to the glass now, almost pulled through to the impossible reflection, but his eyes remained fixed on Ethan. "Do not trade yourself for me," he said. Ethan lowered his hand from the mark. The light did not fade. It spread across his fingers in pale lines, delicate as moonlit veins. "I am done being traded." The words changed the room. The silver symbols on the floor rose from the marble, not as objects, but as light, circling Ethan in slow, graceful arcs. The mirror shuddered. The shadow Adrian finally stood, his smile fading into something like wonder. "There you are." Ethan stepped beside the real Adrian, close enough to feel the cold radiating from the glass, but not close enough to touch it. He raised his glowing hand, and Adrian stared at him as if he were watching sunrise from inside a prison. "What are you doing?" the king whispered. Ethan looked from Adrian to the shadow and understood the choice the room wanted him to make. Save the king by becoming the key. Open the door by surrendering his will. Close it by denying both of them. But there was a fourth choice, small and impossible, the kind no family record would admit and no counsel would plan for. Ethan did not touch the mirror. He touched Adrian's hand. The reaction was immediate. Frost-bright light surged between their joined fingers, and the mirror rang like a bell struck underwater. Adrian inhaled sharply, but he did not pull away. The shadow on the other side stepped back, no longer kneeling, no longer smiling. For the first time, it looked uncertain. "That is not the old command," it said. Ethan tightened his grip on Adrian's hand. "Then learn a new one." The chamber filled with white rain light, and the stop clock began to move. The stop clock moved with one careful tick, and the sound traveled through the bridal chamber like a pulse returning to a body everyone had mistaken for dead. Ethan kept his hand over Adrian's, their joined fingers glowing with pale silver light, while the mirror trembled before them in waves of black glass. The shadow beyond it did not retreat far. It stood in the ruined reflection of the same room, watching with Adrian's face and a stranger's stillness, its blue eyes fixed on their hands, as if it had discovered a language it had never been taught to read. Around Ethan, the silver symbols that had risen from the floor continued to orbit, slow and graceful, circling him and the king together instead of separating them, as the old seals had done. That small difference changed everything. Adrian seemed to feel it too. His breath was still unsteady, but the erasing cold that had crawled along his wrists began to fade, replaced by the clean scent of cedar after rain. He looked at Ethan, and the disbelief in his eyes was almost painful. "You should not be able to do this," he whispered. Ethan's glowing fingers tightened around his. "I have been told what I should not be my whole life. I am beginning to lose interest." Adrian's mouth parted slightly, not in amusement, but in something dangerously close to wonder. The shadow struck one palm against the inside of the mirror, not violently enough to shatter it, but firmly enough that the glass rang out in protest. "This is sentimental foolishness," it said. "The bargain was written in command and obedience. The Miller Moon commands. The Blackwood Knight submits. That is the shape of the door." Ethan turned toward it, keeping his hand linked with Adrian's. Then the bargain was written by people who were afraid of partnership. The chamber answered again. The black candles sparked back to life, but their flames were no longer blue. They burned white, soft and steady, casting the walls in a glow that revealed hidden carvings beneath the marble. Lines of text appeared around the room, old script etched so faintly that it must have been invisible for generations. Adrian stared at the nearest wall. Those were never there. "Yes, they were," the shadow said. "Your family stopped looking." Ethan stepped closer to the wall, and the circling symbols followed him like obedient stars. He did not know the old language, yet the mark on his chest warmed, and meaning unfolded inside his mind. Not word by word, but feeling by feeling. A throne saved by borrowed darkness. A mirror made to hold a king's worst hunger, worst fear, worst loneliness. A Miller Omega chosen to balance it, not destroy it. But somewhere across the years, balance had become control. Control had become secrecy, and secrecy had become a curse. Ethan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. It was never supposed to take your soul, he said, looking back at Adrian. It was supposed to hold the parts of the crown that no one person could carry alone. Adrian's face changed, as if Ethan had placed a name on a wound he had hidden since childhood. My father told me Blackwood kings were born with darkness because power always has a price. Maybe power was never the price, Ethan said. Maybe isolation was. The words made the mirror flicker. For half a second, the shadow's face shifted. Not into a monster, not into something frightening, but into something younger, lonelier, less certain. Then the expression closed again, smooth as ice. Do not make poetry out of a prison, it said. I have waited behind glass while he wore the crown, breathed the air, heard the court say his name. I carried what he refused to feel. I remembered what he was taught to bury. I am not a mistake. Adrian looked at the reflection, and the old fear in him slowly rearranged into grief. No, he said quietly. You are not. The shadow went still. Ethan felt Adrian's hand tremble once beneath his own. It was such a small movement that no one in a throne room would have noticed, but here, in the white candlelight, it felt enormous. I hated you because I thought you were the part of me that doomed everyone who came near, Adrian continued. I locked every mirror in this palace because I believed that if I never looked at you, I could keep others safe. His voice lowered. But you were not the only thing trapped. The mirror's surface softened, the reflection wavering. Ethan could feel the room listening. He could feel the old bargain pressing close, eager to decide the ending in the only ways it knew. Master or servant, key or lock, king or curse. Ethan refused all of them. He released Adrian's hand only long enough to place his palm flat over the glowing mark on his own chest. The light brightened, and his scent filled the room again, rain and white lilies, but now beneath it came something warmer, like sunlight through a window after a long storm. I will not command him, Ethan said to the shadow, and I will not command you. The shadow's eyes narrowed. Then you will fail. No, Ethan said. I will invite. He reached his free hand toward the mirror, stopping an inch before the glass. Adrian caught his breath, but did not stop him. That trust, fragile and new, steadied Ethan more than any spell. You said I was the missing half, Ethan said. But maybe the missing half was never me alone. Maybe it was the choice no one gave either of you. The shadow looked from Ethan to Adrian. And what choice is that? Ethan lifted Adrian's hand until the king's palm hovered beside his own before the mirror. To be whole without making someone else disappear. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Adrian slowly, deliberately, pressed his palm to the glass beside Ethan's. The mirror turned silver from edge to edge. The shadow on the other side stared at their hands, and its perfect imitation of Adrian's face finally broke into something raw, uncertain, and almost human. The room filled with the sound of the clock ticking faster now, not rushing toward doom, but racing toward dawn. Far beyond the sealed doors, palace bells began to stir, though morning was not yet here. Ethan felt the mark on his chest open like a flower made of light, and in that light he saw the truth clearly. He had not come to the palace to survive a curse. He had come to change the meaning of survival itself. The mirror rippled outward, cool and bright beneath their palms, and the shadow whispered, not with hunger this time, but with fear, if I step through, he will remember everything. Adrian did not look away. Then I will remember. Ethan looked at both versions of the king, the crowned man and the abandoned reflection, and said softly, then come back as truth, not as a curse. The glass opened like moonlit water. The glass opened like moonlit water, and the bridal chamber filled with a silence so pure that even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Ethan did not step back. Adrian did not pull him away. Together, they stood before the mirror with their palms hovering at the edge of the impossible doorway, watching the shadow of the king approach from the other side. It no longer moved like a predator made of royal fear. It moved carefully, almost uncertainly, as if crossing that final inch required more courage than all the years it had spent whispering from behind glass. The white candlelight touched its face first, then its hands, then the dark line of its crown, and with every step it took, Adrian beside Ethan trembled as though invisible doors were opening inside him one after another. "Do not let go," Adrian whispered. Ethan tightened his fingers around his hand. "I am here." The shadow paused at the threshold, its blue eyes fixed on Ethan, and for the first time, its voice did not sound like a perfect imitation. It sounded tired. "If I return, he will not remain the man you think you know." Ethan looked at Adrian, at the pale strain on his face, at the king who had warned him, protected him, and feared himself more deeply than anyone in the palace ever had. "I barely know him," Ethan said softly, "but I know enough to believe he deserves the parts of himself that were taken." Adrian closed his eyes, and that was when the shadow stepped through. There was no crash, no storm, no terrible display for the court poets to turn into legend. There was only light, white and silver, rushing through the chamber like rain falling upward. The mirror emptied. The reflection vanished. The shadow moved into Adrian not as an enemy breaking through a wall, but as a memory returning to a locked room. Adrian's hand slipped from Ethan's. He sank to one knee on the black marble, one palm braced against the floor, his breathing uneven, his dark hair falling over his eyes where the crown had been. Ethan dropped beside him without thinking, the train of his wedding clothes spreading around them like spilled moonlight. "Adrian." The king did not answer at first. His shoulders shook once, not from weakness alone, but from the force of remembering. Ethan saw it in fragments reflected across the silver walls. A child prince standing alone before a covered mirror. A father placing a heavy crown on a boy too young to understand its weight. Counselors teaching him that fear was safer than tenderness. 3 sealed ceremonies Adrian had tried to stop and failed. Years of locked rooms. Untouched meals. And orders written in a hand that grew colder because warmth had become dangerous. The curse had not been a beast hiding inside him. It had been every emotion a Blackwood king was forbidden to feel, gathered and exiled until it learned to speak with his face. Adrian lifted his head at last, and his eyes were still blue, still sharp, but no longer empty of grief. Tears shone there, unshed and almost startling. "I remember them," he said. "All of them." Ethan knew he meant the ones who had come before. He did not offer comfort too quickly. Some pain deserved silence before words try to soften it. He only placed one hand over Adrian's, not gripping, not commanding, simply present. Adrian looked at their hands, then at Ethan's face, as if he could not understand why anyone would remain after seeing the truth. "You should hate me." Ethan's answer came quietly. "I hate what was done. I hate everyone who kept choosing silence because it was convenient. But I do not think you were free either." The mark on Ethan's chest glowed again, and this time the light traveled outward, not toward the mirror, but toward the sealed doors. The old silver locks melted into lines of writing, then into dust-bright sparks that rose and vanished before touching the ceiling. Far away, beyond the private wing, the palace bells began to ring in confusion, one tower after another waking before dawn. Adrian stared at the doors as they opened by themselves. "The court will be waiting. Let them wait," Ethan said. The words surprised him with their own steadiness. For one night, every noble in the kingdom had expected him to become another quiet tragedy. For one night, his family had imagined him erased and useful. For one night, the palace had prepared a story without asking whether he wished to live inside it. That night was almost over. Adrian reached for the fallen crown, but his hand stopped before touching it. The black-silver circlet lay on the marble beside a white rose that had lost its wax and shine and opened naturally, petal by petal. Ethan picked up the crown instead. It was heavier than he expected, cold, beautiful, and lonely. Adrian looked up at him, still kneeling. A king without his crown, an alpha without his mask, A man waiting to learn whether the Omega he had tried to save would now leave him behind. Ethan held the crown between them and said, "If you wear this again, do not wear it alone." Adrian's breath caught. Slowly, with a humility no court had ever witnessed, he bowed his head. Ethan did not place the crown back on him. Not yet. Instead, he offered his free hand. Adrian took it and rose with him as the first pale line of morning touched the windows. In the empty mirror behind them, there was no shadow waiting, only two figures standing side by side, changed by the night but not consumed by it. Then the doors opened fully, and the court saw that Ethan Miller had survived. For a moment, no one in the corridor moved, because the court had prepared itself for silence, not footsteps. They had gathered before the sealed doors in ceremonial black, faces arranged in a grief they did not feel yet knew how to perform, with priests holding silver bowls, servants carrying white cloths, and nobles already rehearsing the careful language of another royal tragedy. Then Ethan Miller stepped into the morning light with his wedding clothes unmarked, his pale hair loose from the night, and the scent of rain and white lilies drifting around him like the first weather after a drought. Beside him stood Adrian Blackwood without his crown. That was the detail that frightened them more than Ethan being alive. The Alpha King, who had built his reign on distance and command, stood bareheaded in the open doorway with Ethan's hand in his own, and his face no longer looked carved from ice. It looked awake. Whispers broke through the corridor in a wave. Impossible. The Omega survived. The curse spared him. No, said the high priest, his voice thin with shock. He stared at the matching black silver marks now visible at Ethan's chest and Adrian's wrist, glowing faintly beneath the first light of dawn. It did not spare him. It recognized him. Ethan felt Adrian's hand tighten, but this time the gesture asked permission instead of giving orders. Ethan did not pull away. At the back of the corridor, Lord Miller pushed through the crowd with Caleb at his side, both dressed in mourning colors so elegant that Ethan almost laughed. His father's expression shifted too quickly from disbelief to calculation, and that small change told Ethan everything he still needed to know. The man had not come to grieve his son. He had come to collect whatever reward remained after a sacrifice. "Your Majesty," Lord Miller said, bowing low, though his eyes kept darting to Ethan's glowing mark. "This is a blessing beyond measure. House Miller is honored that our son has served the crown so well." Ethan looked at him and felt the old cold stone inside his chest crack, not from pain, but from release. For years, that voice had been law. That approval had been a locked door he kept knocking on with bleeding hope. Now it sounded small in the palace corridor, almost fragile beneath the ringing bells. Adrian turned his head slowly. The corridor quieted at once. "Served?" the king repeated. Lord Miller paled, but forced a smile. "I only mean that Ethan has fulfilled the purpose for which he was chosen." Adrian's eyes sharpened. Yet before he could speak, Ethan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "No," Ethan said. "I was not chosen. I was hidden. I was drugged, lied to, and sold because my family knew my bloodline mattered more than my life." The word struck the court harder than any shout could have. Caleb's face went white. Lord Miller's mouth opened, but no answer came quickly enough. The high priest looked from Ethan to the old writing now glowing faintly along the chamber walls behind him. Whatever he saw there made him lower his eyes. The Miller line was bound to the Blackwood mirror, the priest whispered. The records were sealed after the third generation. Adrian's voice was calm, but no longer cold. "Then unseal them." The command moved through the corridor like a door opening across the entire kingdom. Several counselors exchanged fearful looks. Lord Miller took one step back. "Your Majesty, with respect, old family matters are delicate." Ethan smiled then, not sweetly, not cruelly, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally stopped asking to be permitted to exist. "So was I." The silence that followed belonged to him. Adrian bent, picked up the fallen crown from Ethan's hands, and for one breath, everyone seemed to expect him to place it back upon his own head and restore the world they understood. Instead, he held it between himself and Ethan. This crown survived by teaching every Blackwood king to divide himself, Adrian said to the court. That ended tonight. He turned to the high priest. From this morning forward, no marriage will be ordered in the name of the curse. No Omega will be offered to the throne, and no noble house will hide a child behind bloodline secrets again. The high priest bowed. One by one, the servants followed. Then the guards. Then, reluctantly, the nobles. Lord Miller remained standing too long, until Caleb pulled him down by the sleeve. Ethan watched them bow and felt no triumph. Only the strange emptiness that came when a cage door opened and the bird inside needed a moment to understand the sky was real. Adrian leaned close enough that only Ethan could hear. You can leave this palace if you wish. I will not stop you. Ethan looked toward the long windows. Beyond them, the city was waking beneath a silver dawn, candles still burning outside the gates. Thousands of people waiting to learn whether they had witnessed another ending or the beginning of a different story. He thought of the Miller estate, of locked collars and bitter medicine, of a life spent being told he was nothing. Then he looked at Adrian, not as a monster, not as a savior, but as a man standing beside the ruins of the same lie. I'm not staying because I was given away, Ethan said. I'm staying because I choose to see what we become after this. Adrian's breath caught, and the faintest warmth touched his eyes. Behind them, inside the bridal chamber, the empty mirror brightened with the morning sun. For the first time in generations, it reflected only the room, the roses, and the open doors. But just before Ethan turned away, the glass shimmered once, and a line of old silver script appeared across its surface. When the moon refuses to kneel, the night learns how to dawn.